This is week 4 of this message series that we called Where is God? Frequently when this question is asked, it's being asked because a significant change just happened in the life of a person, in their health, their well-being, or when some tragedy has happened to themselves or someone they've loved. And that's when trying to give a clear answer is also the most difficult time. As we've listened to the readings over the last few weeks, we've seen figures in both the Old and the New Testament find some way to answer the question for themselves. We heard it in that first week with the prophet Elijah. He stood in the gentle breeze at the cave, at the entrance to the cave on the mountaintop, and met the Lord in that gentle breeze. It wasn't in the wind or the earthquake or the fire. It was in the stillness. I had experience a few days later when I was sitting in the church at Christ the Priest, and it was a beautiful sunny morning, and the sun came in, and I was reflecting on this particular passage, and I just felt warmed all over, and I knew then that the Lord, in a very real way, was with me. And then we heard the Canaanite woman. She challenged Jesus to broaden his own understanding of what his mission was about when she begged him to cure her daughter. We heard how she was initially rebuffed, but then she came back at him, and in her response, Jesus was able to see that she was a woman of deep faith, and so her daughter was cured. And then last week we heard Peter make that beautiful statement when he said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied that it was not through some earthly wisdom that Peter was able to make this statement. It was by the power of God. Because Jesus told him, "Simon, son of Jonah, you are a happy man, because it was not flesh and blood that revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven." Now remember, that was the words that Jesus said to Peter at that occasion. It was not flesh and blood that revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. We'll come back to that shortly. In all these experiences, we have people of faith being reminded that they found God in things that happened in their life in many and in varied ways. But they have to admit that there is no simple answer to the question, where is God? We can find it in the lives of others. We can speak about it in our own lives, but we come back to the dilemma of how do we answer the question for people when something bigger than themselves or some tragedy has happened? Where do we find and help them gain an answer in those times? Now, before you think I'm about to give you the answer, or at least an answer that will resolve every challenge, it's almost impossible this side of heaven to be able to answer the question properly. But let me remind you that our readings over these weeks and over the next couple of weeks can take us a little deeper into awareness of how people of faith do find something that helps them answer the question in one way or other. We start today with the prophet Jeremiah. We heard last weekend that when Jesus asked the question, who do people say the Son of Man is, one of their immediate answers was Jeremiah, recognized as one of the great prophets of the Old Testament. Jeremiah did not have it easy. There were many who reviled him and who made him suffer for being a prophet, and the language of the passage today highlights some of his difficulties. He's caught between a desire to do the will of God, and we heard that at the beginning of the passage. He said, "You have seduced me, Lord, and I've let myself be seduced. You have overpowered me because you were stronger." And so he knows the power of God. But then he says, as a result of that, each time I speak the word, I have to howl and proclaim violence and ruin. The word of the Lord, he says, has meant for me insult, derision, all day long. So the message that Jeremiah was trying to speak to the people was a message they didn't want to hear. He was speaking, telling them that God was going to punish them for their corruptness and their sin, and that they would not be able to be, or no longer would be in God's favour. But Jeremiah has to speak the message. He says that towards the end, there seemed to be a fire burning in my heart, imprisoned in my bones. Jeremiah is telling the people, he's telling us, that answering God's call and being faithful to his plan, it can only happen when we're truly open to his presence in our life. When God is with us, we can respond, since hopefully there is something like that fire burning within us. We're able to overcome the difficulties and challenges of life because we know we're not alone. We hear that frequently in the letter that Paul writes. He speaks to the people, some communities that he founded, some communities that he had visited. He speaks to them about how God works in their life. And he's always calling them to have a deeper fidelity and relationship with God. He's urging the people constantly to turn away from the ways of the world, embrace a whole new way of living. He reminds them of God's mercy as he tells them in the passage from today, "Think of God's mercy, my brothers and sisters, and worship him. I beg you in any way that is worthy of thinking people, by offering your living bodies as a holy sacrifice that is truly pleasing to God." And then he reminds them that demands something different from the way of the world. He says, "Do not model yourself on the behavior of the world around you, but let your behavior change, modeled by your new life." Like Jeremiah, Paul is urging the people of Rome to respond to the challenges they faced by offering your living bodies as a holy sacrifice. It's not some chance statement that Paul is making. And it's an expression of how he was living his life, what he was giving for the gospel message. And he's calling the Romans to do the same. Because not only is this what God asks of us, Paul is telling us it's the perfect thing to do. Now, going back to last Sunday's reading, Matthew concluded the passage by saying, "Then he gave the disciples strict orders not to tell anyone that he was the Christ." We heard that Peter had done this because God had touched his life. Now, there have been a number of occasions when Jesus has said this to the disciples or to someone that he's cured. But each time he's told them not to do it until after the resurrection. Here, he doesn't state a time, nor does he give a reason why he doesn't want them to speak about it. Now, the reason I mention this is today, the passage starts, Jesus began to make clear to his disciples that he was destined to go to Jerusalem and to suffer grievously, to be put to death, and to be raised up on the third day. Now, that most definitely, if you're with a group of friends and your friend tells you that, is something that's going to start a conversation. And that's exactly what happens. Peter immediately responds, "Heaven preserve us, Lord, this must not happen to you." Last week, Peter was praised for what he had said. This week, he's condemned. The difference in understanding about when Jesus speaks about the role of the Messiah and how the disciples understand that message. We know that last weekend, as I mentioned, the disciples had yet to make that real conversion of faith that takes them from seeing Jesus as the healer, as the preacher, into understanding his role as what the suffering Messiah will be like, the Messiah that Isaiah had prophesied so much earlier in their journey. Peter's response highlights the challenge that we all face as we seek to understand how God works in our world. That it's not in easy answers to our problems or in the all is well with everything utopia that we might hope for. It's only in the cross of Christ that the plan of God is made real. Because after rebuking Peter and telling him to step aside, Jesus then proclaims something quite powerful. He tells them, "If anyone wants to be a follower of mine, let him renounce himself and take up his cross and follow me." He's saying to them that it is only via the cross that we can be saved. And then he goes even further and reminds them and says very powerfully, For anyone who wants to save his life will lose it, but anyone who loses his life for my sake will find it. The story of our salvation centres very clearly on the cross, not just the cross of Christ, but the cross that each of us is called to carry. Some of you might have been at Christ the Priest on Good Friday this year, when after the reading of the Passion, some of the youth who'd been involved in the Stations of the Cross earlier in the morning performed a tableau as a reflection to the reading. At the end of their tableau, the children were scattered around the sanctuary, all looking at the cross, and there was silence. It was the most incredibly powerful statement these young people made, and they admitted it was by accident because nobody knew when to move. But the fact that they were there, all gazing at the cross, reminded us that the story of salvation is via the cross. As Jesus says in the Gospel, what will it gain a person if they win the whole world and ruin their life? Or what has anyone to offer in exchange for his life? Jesus reminds us that it's only in the giving of ourselves that we come to the glory of resurrection. And so this question that sits behind our message series, Where is God?, doesn't have a simple response. But each week our readings are pointing us towards an answer. It isn't an easy, comfortable or glib answer. God is not found in the lifestyle of the world, as so many in our age seem to want. God is most often found in the challenges of life, times when we acknowledge that we don't have the answers, when we open ourselves to the power and the presence of Christ in one another and in the church, the presence of a Christ who was prepared to suffer and to die so that we might have life and have it to the full. Others will also be open to an answer when we, by our lifestyle, are generous and gracious towards them as we acknowledge and give thanks for the love and the graciousness and the mercy of our God.